The book that I recently published, that has been gently introduced by Fabrizio, is the culmination of a long research journey that brought me to question a fundamental cornerstone in the narrative of the rise of modern science and of modernity itself, namely that the geological antiquity of the Earth was discovered between the Enlightenment and the early 19th century, thanks to the progressive secularization of the European culture that made it possible to disprove literary readings of the supposedly undisputed creation story of Genesis. On the contrary, I found that overwhelming evidence shows that the Genesis account coexisted in medieval and early modern Europe with competing or even complementary theories that assumed an extremely old world characterized by slow geological forces and renewed by periodical natural catastrophes. The Aristotelian natural philosophy, entrenched in the university, posited, of course, that the Earth was not only ancient, but even eternal. Still, for the last 250 years, more or less, this has been regarded as highly unorthodox doctrines with a limited impact outside a restricted intellectual elite. My research demonstrates instead that such notions spread unhindered, even in vernacular culture and in didactic literature, and that they were easily accessible to readers without a formal education. And finally, that the religious authorities normally consider them unproblematic. Today, I would like to talk specifically of scientific works in the vernacular dealing with what I call, for want of a better term, Earth history, works composed between the late 13th and the mid 16th century. This literature had never been explored systematically before, and above all, it had never been considered in its historical continuity and its relations with scholarly works in both vernacular and Latin. As a whole, I think that this corpus constitutes the most compelling evidence for the societal penetration and the widespread cultural acceptance of the possibility of an ancient Earth well before its supposed discovery in the 18th century. At the same time, it shows that there was no such thing as a secular high culture in Latin for intellectual elites, and a vernacular low culture hopefully tied to a religious worldview and to a literal reading of the scriptural account of the creation. While literary formats and standards might have been adapted to different audiences, the information conveyed and the overall approach to natural knowledge were not fundamentally different between Latin and vernacular works, to the point that works originally composed in the vernacular could even become the basis for Latin versions, rather than the other way around, as it normally happened. Since a comprehensive examination of the subject would be impossible in the limited time available today, I will focus on a selection of relevant works that is necessarily limited, but I believe highly significant. First of all, it is important to remember that what we would call now geology or Earth history did not enjoy any disciplinary autonomy, but were normally discussed within the larger field of meteorology. That was considered especially suitable, by the way, as an introduction to natural philosophy to those without formal education in Latin. Also, meteorological subjects were often addressed even in books dealing primarily with other subjects, and were ubiquitous in commentaries and didactic encyclopedias, both Latin and vernacular, that became increasingly popular in the second half of the 13th century. In Italy, the best known and the most read among them was arguably Brunetto Latini's Book of Treasure, written in the mid-1260s in Old French, but soon translated into Tuscan. The authors were normally scholars or members of the intellectual professions themselves, yet the first scientific treatise in an Italian vernacular conceived as an original work rather than as a translation or adaptation from a Latin original was written by a craftsman. All available sources suggest that the author of this composition of the world, completed in 1282, was the same restorer of Arezzo that was active in the same years and in that same Tuscan city as a painter, a goldsmith, and maybe even as an illuminator and a bell founder. The fact that this surviving work attributed in part to Restorer is signed is significant. Restorer's time coincided with the first emergence of an artisanal elite conscious of its growing social and cultural relevance. It is telling that Restorer considered the mastery of the figurative arts and of the manual practices connected with them as crucial to understand the natural world. While astronomy and astrology topped every other science, drawing, engraving, and painting came immediately behind. In the composition of the world, interestingly, the author merged his bodily and empirical experience of nature with a robust theoretical framework that was mainly derived from Latin translations from the Arabic. Restorer's discussion of the emergence of dry land, of the flood, and of their causes is an impressive document of how events described in the Bible could be absorbed within the structure of a natural philosophy based on Greek and Arabic sources, and of how easily the medieval Italian society could accept the ancient earth it entailed. The Toscan artist adopted the widespread idea that the magnet-like influence of the northern stars pushed the ocean away from our hemisphere while attracting the element of earth, so as to form mountain ranges that he compared to the backbone in the human body. While this doctrine was vigorously opposed by Dante Alighieri in his famous Quaestio de Aqua et Terra, it seems to have been especially popular in vernacular context and literature. And in fact, it was adopted even by Brunetto Latini. Smaller mountains are formed by the floods of the sea that periodically submerge parts of the earth, moving dirt from one location to another and leaving behind the petrified remains of sea creatures, what we call fossils. Ristoro insisted that even the most ruinous flood possible in nature could never be universal, as part of the earth would always emerge from the sphere of water. A man sufficiently skilled in the science of the stars might then be able to forecast the coming of the deluge in the part of the earth he inhabits, and save himself, like that wise man Noah reportedly did. And thanks to the knowledge that he was given, and I'm quoting from Ristoro, he made arrangements in advance, and he saved himself and his family from the danger of the flood in the ark. Now, Ristoro saw clearly no reason why this naturalistic account should conflict with the theological one of the Bible. The Noetic catastrophe narrated by the Genesis was simply the most recent of the great inundations that periodically scourge parts of the earth, endowed on that particular occasion with a providential meaning. While Noah received advice of the impending disaster from God, in principle, this knowledge was attainable even with human means. And absolutely nothing suggests that he was thinking within the narrow limits of the traditional chronology, nor that his approach ever raised religious concepts. Scholars have seen some annotations in later manuscripts of the composition of the world as interventions of preemptive censorship, meant to diffuse the impacts of his doctrine. In fact, the most significant and widely cited gloss that I cite here had nothing to do, as you can see yourself, with religion, and everything to do with Ristor's contention that craftsmen can bring an essential contribution to the knowledge of nature. Invoking the authority of Aristotle, an anonymous interpolator objected that no one can reach knowledge unless he is entirely removed from human affairs. Science cannot be learned but while plowing, wandering, running, and eating. It requires rest and concentration. The author of this gloss was arguably a traditional scholar, possibly a layman well acquainted with scientific literature in the vernacular, who finds himself confronted with one of the first manifestations of a different way of conceiving the study of nature. The chapters explaining that the flood is a recurrent natural phenomenon, that none can ever be universal, including Noah's, and that Noah himself could have forecast the event through astrology, did not elicit any intervention. Now, this does not mean that design and finalism did not pervade Ristoros's cosmos and his book. On the contrary, the builder of the universe was often praised as the perfect craftsman who engineered the world in the best possible way. As herein stated at every opportunity, astral influences and natural laws were just ministers of God's will. Still, in line with contemporary natural philosophy, he maintained that nature should be explained not by way of miracles, but through reason and reasonable explanations. Ristoro's book was still read in Florence in the 1480s, when humanist and architect Antonio Manetti made the last extant copy, and it might have been the source of Leonardo da Vinci's famous analogy between the circulation of fluids in the human body and in that of the Earth. Aristotle composition of the world seems to have been valued as well as an accessible introduction to astronomy and astrology, and for its descriptions of constellations, planets, and of their influences. Indeed, it was one of those vernacular scientific works found worthy of a Latin adaptation. Here you can see pages from a Latin composition of the world, a printed version from a translation written in the year 1300s by philosopher Paul of Venice. That was largely a summary of the Toscan artist's book, and might have targeted particularly university students or educated but non-specialist reader. It was reprinted later several times, even in illustrated edition like this one from Venice, but then in the 1500s until the 1520s, it was printed especially in France, in Lyon. Now, Paul of Venice's operation appears especially interesting insofar as it reveals what the adaptation of a vernacular text to more scholarly standards entailed. Apart from turning it into Latin, Paul of Venice carefully removed Aristotle's exaltation of the artist and of his special knowledge of nature, as well as every religious and scriptural reference. In general, one difference between vernacular works like Aristotle's and more scholarly literature is that vernacular works tended to leave more space for explanations of final causes, and they often integrated biblical stories, such as that of Noah's flood, into the history of the earth, whereas Latin commentaries excluded them entirely in general. And attention is sometimes apparent, not only between adaptations from one language to the other, but also between vernacular versions of scholarly texts and their readers. The issue normally was not one of secular versus religious worldviews. This was not the point. Nor did anyone question the legitimacy of a rational investigation of nature. The problem is that, for what I've seen, is that lay audiences found it difficult to grasp the methodological and epistemological curtains erected by scholars between theology and natural philosophy in the course of the 13th century. For example, the reader of the early 13th century the early 1300s vernacular meteorology studied by Rita Librandi was not too satisfied with that book. In all likelihood, he was neither a scholar nor an ecclesiastic, but a merchant conversant with vernacular scientific literature, but also with the routes traded by Florentine commerce. And he also left a number of notes on the manuscript that he read. This merchant probably was keen on direct and straightforward information, and he did not seem to have had much patience for the bells and whistles, or rather the pro and contra, of the commentary format. However, his main criticism was not about prolixity. He felt that an account of the physical history of the world should address not only observation, reason, and natural causes, but also the book of Genesis. His point, however, was not the creation took place in 6 literal days, or that the history of the earth must be compressed within the limits of the biblical chronology, but that the final and supernatural causes of the universe should not be excluded from the narration, which is more or less what Aristotle does. But that said, he readily acknowledged that God operates in the world through natural causes, not miracles, and that the problem of the emergence of dry land must be addressed naturally and according to astrology. Latinist treasure, Aristotle's composition, and this Florentine meteorology address different levels of the vernacular public, but they all contributed to the diffusion of a late scientific culture between the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. The Latinist treasure, reflected a time that preceded the massive penetration of Aristotelian philosophy into Christian Europe and ensuing need to treat reason and revelation as fundamentally different cognitive modes. Aristotle's later treatise adopted a methodological separation between theology and natural philosophy, but his work was still pervaded with the presence of the divine. 20 or 30 years later, the Florentine meteorology no longer addressed the providential causes of natural occurrences. Still, there is no evidence that their readers were disturbed or scandalized by the largest secular science they expounded, nor is there any evidence that the diffusion of this literature among vernacular public alarmed the ecclesiastical authorities. Of course, red lines existed. It could be dangerous to cross them or even approach them. The world had been created and was not eternal. Astral influences did not restrain human freedom. Noah's flood may or may not have been universal or part of the order of nature, but it did happen, and it also happened to punish humankind's sins. Those strongholds could not be touched, but almost everything else was fair game, whether in Latin or in the vernacular. You could indeed stand on the edge of eternity, as long as you did not cross that threshold. Now, some of this literature arguably represented only the tip of the iceberg of a culture that remained overwhelmingly oral. Ristoro's book remains an exceedingly rare example, since even scientific works in the vernacular were usually composed by scholars. And even when artists and craftsmen began to compose their own books and treatises after the year 1400, they mostly described their art and its practical operations, usually avoiding subjects that belonged to natural philosophy proper. They did not do so necessarily because of ignorance of natural philosophy, especially meteorology, whose main tenets, in my opinion, were quite widespread, even among craftsmen and artists, but because they were not relevant to the subject at hand. And indeed, meteorological literature would be a poor indicator of the kind of information that was commonly available in central and northern Italy on the nature of the Earth's surface. Finding minerals for furnaces and guns, construction stones for public and private buildings, and water sources for cities was part of the resumes of many late medieval and Renaissance artists and engineers. Earth strata are an outstanding example of geological feature almost entirely ignored in meteorological literature, yet actually studied by miners and engineers for practical purposes. By the early 1400s, at the latest, Tuscan prospectors had accurately characterized the layered rocks and relied on the properties of the various strata to detect the location of water sources that could be channeled into aqueducts or that had to be avoided when it came to laying down the foundations of new buildings. Around 1440, for example, Leon Battista Alberti recognized in his architectural treatise that the water prospectors had discovered how the whole crust of the earth, and mountains in particular, consist of page-like skins, some denser, some more rarefied, some thicker, and some thinner. In the rare occasions when meteorological works discussed geological strata, they invariably related their origin to the extreme antiquity of the earth. Among them, Avicenna surmised that they likely formed through successive inundations of the sea in immemorial times, each flood leaving a new layer. Even alternative explanations implied long timescales. Restoro of Arezzo argued that the mountains were the tools used by the heavens to shape the surface of the earth. In the same way, a blacksmith needs to make his anvil before he can forge metal. So the attraction of the northern stars built mountains one layer upon the other, just like an anvil is made by laying down successive sheets of iron. So bewildering rocky landscapes in which cracking and crumbling mountains expose their layered interiors to the observers were ubiquitous in 15th century Italian paintings. Historians of geology have long recognized that those representations cannot be considered accurate portrayals of existing geological features, and clearly not for want of technical means or naturalistic knowledge. Masters like Mantegna, Botticelli, Giovanni Bellini, and many others represent these rocks and mountains as idealized forms rather than as exact depictions of existing natural objects. Yet, their visual language may have embedded commonly held views on the nature of the Earth's surface. Avicenna's statement that most mountains were in a condition of decay, with new growth and formation being the exception rather than the norm as the world approached its next renovation, would be a good characterization of those scenarios. What lay before them was a world of ruins, scarred by the unequivocal signs of the passage of time. Towering rocks made their last stand against erosion, while a succession of broken and twisted soils attested to the ancient vicissitudes of the world. In fractured rocks and split mountains, their patrons would have easily recognized the sectional views of the earth, which does reveal its antiquity, just like the dissected architectures they were often associated with. Against this background, Leonardo da Vinci's geological writings take on an entirely new meaning. Historians have long framed Leonardo's inventive genius within the tradition of 15th century Tuscan engineering, but the paucity of comparable sources and of studies on medieval meteorology have made it difficult to contextualize his geological notes. His descriptions of layered rocks, his rejection of Noah's flood as the origin of marine fossils, and his obvious disregard for the chronology of the Bible remain in popular and, to an extent, even academic literature, the hallmarks of a unique genius centuries ahead of his time. In reality, he was indebted, on the one hand, to the medieval vernacularizations that continued to circulate, and scholarly literature that he tried to read, and on the other hand, to deeply stratified craft knowledge, and which was often difficult and perhaps even pointless to tell apart from his own personal observations and thoughts. For example, his description of different geological layers closely resembles that of the prospectors mentioned by Alberti 50 or 60 years later. Is not the same, thus revealing not that he copied from that source, but they both used a common source of knowledge. Leonardo's rejection of Noah's flood as the origin of marine fossils was, on the other hand, entirely mainstream in his time, and the common explanations found in literature invoked partial floods, the withdrawal of the sea, or the immersion of dry land over long periods of time, or incomplete spontaneous generation within rocks. And in many cases, natural philosophers considered the idea that the biblical flood would have left marine fossils on mountaintops as a popular story, which was not worth consideration by natural philosophers. That the Earth might be just a few thousand years old never crossed Leonardo's mind. He never discussed the biblical chronology of the creation, not because it was too much of an issue, as often stated in literature, but because it was not an issue at all. Likewise, his famous deluge drawings are representations not of the biblical flood, but of any of the recurrent watery catastrophes whose existence was more or less unquestioned. This is not to deny, of course, the importance and the pervasiveness of the Christian chronological tradition that built upon the assumption of a young creation, whose time, at least in principle, could be reckoned precisely. My argument is different. My argument is that this chronological tradition coexisted with a variety of other viewpoints that were openly discussed and easily available even to philosophically illiterate readers. This was still true when, around 1540, Venetian publishers and authors identified a public for scientific and technical texts in the vernacular and promptly set out to exploit it. Like their medieval counterparts, they made no effort whatsoever to assuage the secular tone prevailing in the universities and in scholarly literature. In most cases, they limited themselves to conflate, modify, or simplify the Latin compendia and summaries that represented their main sources. The new genre was inaugurated in earnest in 1540 by Alessandro Piccolomini's On the Fixed Stars and on the Sphere of the World. The author declared his intention to work on a translation of the meteorology as well, because it was the most logical thing to do. Meteorology was the basic introduction to natural philosophy for a larger public. But he was preceded by Sebastiano Fausto da Longiano and by his short vernacular treatise on meteorology, published in Venice in 1542. This work is arguably linked to the larger 16th century program to vernacularize Aristotle's natural philosophy that has been studied by Marcus Garvey and others. Yet one should note that this is not a straight version of the Greek philosopher's Meteorologica, nor does he want to be. Like many of his medieval counterparts, Longiano conceived his book as a collection sourced from a number of different authors. So an overview of the field of meteorology, which is basically all of the topics that Aristotle deals in the book with the same title. His chapter on the origins of mountains, in particular, was basically a summary of the relevant pages in Paulus Venice's Latin exposition of Aristotle's natural books, that was composed in the early 1400s as a compendium for university students. This is the same Paul of Venice that translated Aristotle's composition of the world into Latin. Longiano attributed the origin of mountains to the same causes listed by Paul of Venice, and he followed him closely even the description of the permutation between seas and dry land, whose cycle of 36,000 years represented only the period of the cyclical renovation of the earth, not its age, that could be considered eternal for all practical and philosophical purposes. And so, as Longiano writes, the sea has to move elsewhere, and when the sea is now, there will be land, which is the basic Aristotelian theory of geological change. And it is true that this will happen in, so as to speak, an almost infinite amount of time. The term eternal could cover, in fact, a breadth of different assumptions and interpretations. Most readers would probably take for granted that the universe was created recently and treat its eternity as a purely theoretical postulate in Aristotelian philosophy, with no bearing on its true age. But others would understand it as created, but of undetermined and possibly very great age. This is a reading that is attested. And all the more so, since the medieval and Renaissance philosophical vocabulary lacked an equivalent term. This solution, that is an earth of undetermined age, but possibly very old, could be judged either innocuous or potentially dangerous theologically, but it was absolutely not theoretical. Many would have found both reading possible and valid, rather than mutually exclusive. The reason is that natural philosophy in general, and meteorology in particular, that is based on induction, dealt with the range of what was probable, that is, physically possible and not contrary to the faith, something that could be legitimately entertained, rather than pick a single answer with exclusion of every other. And finally, some could even take it literally and assume that the earth was indeed eternal. Apparently, no one told Longiano or forced Longiano to specify what he meant with eternal. I believe that the intentional ambiguity of this terminology had long been a cornerstone of the philosopher's intellectual freedom. But by the late 1400s, it was increasingly frowned upon as a smokescreen put up to protect the diffusion of heresy from ecclesiastical interference. In 1513, the Lateran Council V recommended that clear heretical doctrines, which were essentially the eternity of the world and the mortality of the intellective soul, should not be taught, and if taught, that the readers or auditors be reminded of their falsity. As Longiano's book shows, the conciliary decrees did not have any practical impact for the moment. 30 years later, popularizers could still spread the notion of the eternity of the world in vernacular works addressed to the largest possible public by design without any qualification. Nowhere does Longiano seem to think that he might offend the religious sensibility of the readers, or that his book might attract the unwanted attention of the ecclesiastical authorities. Indeed, it did not receive any. Thank you for your attention.